But then if there was something that was kind of half-baked that supported the narrative, there would be blaring from the headlines about how important this is. I mean, things like saying that, the pandemic could end in 6 weeks if 90% of people just wore a cloth mask, and all these other things that were constantly trotted out with very little actual rigor behind them. And so when you look at the policies, and we'll start with Dr. Malone, I mean, obviously there have been a lot of failures of the policies. How do you reflect on that? What has been effective? What hasn't? And what does it say about the overall medical establishment that people who wanted to dissent from those policies and were right were nevertheless treated very poorly?
Well, that's kind. Thank you for teeing that up. And I don't whine about what the press has subjected me to or my colleagues. One thing I did want to mention is I'm here representing the International Alliance of Physicians and Medical Scientists, which is over 17,000 physicians and medical scientists. It's the source of many of these folks that are here on your monitors. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to represent them and also to represent the Unity Project, which is a California-based organization that is opposed to the mandates for children that Governor Newsom, who, if there's a contrapositive to yourself, I would say we'd have a coin toss between Governors Newsom and Inslee. So congratulations, particularly on the immigration from my old home in California here to the free state of Florida. But in terms of the policies, the International Alliance has made a series of very clear, unambiguous statements. There is no justification for mandating vaccines for children, full stop. We're of the strong opinion that if there is risk, there must be choice. This is fundamental medical bioethics 101. Number two, as far as we're concerned, there is no medical emergency now, and there is therefore no justification for the declaration of medical emergency and the suspension of rights that has occurred with that re-upping of the medical emergency by the executive branch, let's say gently. Our opinion has been that the hunting of physicians and the restriction of physicians' ability to prescribe and treat with early treatment. Another thing that the state of Florida has led on that we're very grateful for is enabling physicians the latitude to provide early treatment to patients. We have really tried to advocate for the ability of physicians to just practice medicine.
Why the hostility to that, though? I mean, we had different, there were generic drugs that people talked about, very hostile response to that. But then even things that would get EUA from the FDA, like the monoclonal antibodies, you never heard Fauci talking about that at all. We started doing it in Florida, and we were criticized for it. So why, it was almost like lockdown mask until there's a vaccine, and there was a hostility to even discussing the idea of early treatment.
So in order to answer that question, I have to get into Tony Fauci's head and that of Rochelle Walensky, which I refuse to do for a number of reasons. So I could only speculate, but the observation has been repeatedly made that technically the emergency use authorization clauses, which have been what has been used to authorize these vaccines, and to be clear to everybody, there is no licensed vaccine available for purchase and use in the United States. The licenses that have been provided are for products with labeling that don't exist in the United States. Those manufacturers are not distributing that. So the only thing that your school children in your state has available in terms of vaccines is still emergency use authorized products with all of the associated liability, waiver, protection, et cetera. But without going down into conspiracy rabbit holes, the most straightforward explanation of the behavior is that the emergency use authorization clauses require that there are no other alternative treatments available. So the speculation is, and there are data information supporting this, for instance, with Janet Woodcock and hydroxychloroquine and Rick Bright, videotaped evidence that there was an intentional effort to circumvent the will of the President of the United States, who had specifically requested and required that hydroxychloroquine be made available on an outpatient basis. And there was an intentional decision on the part of Janet Woodcock, who then became acting director of the FDA, who at the time was leading Operation Warp Speed for drugs, together with Rick Bright, who was the head of BARDA at the time, to make it so that physicians would not have access and not have authorization to hydroxychloroquine, an agent which the Chinese government used for treating COVID, which had a long documented history of utility as an antiviral, and which had demonstrated effectiveness for SARS-CoV-1 back with that prior experience. So I thank you for the question, Governor. I don't know what goes on in Dr. Fauci's head, and I don't know about the Byzantine, even though I'm a government specialist. There's a lot of this stuff that goes on behind closed doors. We use phrases like deep state, but the truth is that there was clearly an intention on the part of key decision makers within the government hierarchy within Health and Human Services to prevent physicians from being able to administer repurposed drugs, of which there are many, which can save lives when administered early. Pretty much there is a huge laundry list of anti-inflammatories and other strategies which, when administered early, absolutely will save lives.
And Dr. Risch, you had mentioned you were involved in this very early on. What type of response have you gotten when you're discussing things that depart from some of the mitigation strategies or a compulsory vaccination regime?
Well, it's interesting that there's been a lot of misdirection from what we've seen. We put out our scientific understandings and evidence, and then we get criticized on things that we didn't say. And I think part of the problem has been that what's been purveyed to our society is plausibility, but not science. There's a big difference between things that seem plausible and things that are scientific. And so lockdowns are plausible, but they're not scientific. And the scientific evidence, as we've seen, is how harmful they've been. The same has been true for the medications, that hospital studies have shown lesser effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine than outpatient studies. Nevertheless, the FDA put up a huge warning webpage warning hydroxychloroquine should not be used for outpatients when it had no data on outpatient adverse events. It only had data on hospital events, and hospital COVID is a totally different disease with different symptoms, different outcomes, different treatment. Nevertheless, the FDA put up this warning, which is still there today, that frightened doctors across the world from using hydroxychloroquine and provided impetus to pharma regulatory boards and medical regulating boards to prevent doctors from prescribing hydroxychloroquine, in spite of the fact that there's now 10 studies showing how effective it is in reducing mortality risk. But one thing I want to say is that and apropos of what everybody else has been saying about mandates and the fact that we're not in a state of emergency. In fact, Dr. Ladapo mentioned early on that we have a tension in public health between protecting the community and individuals' maintenance of their inherent rights. That's a tension that has to be negotiated in each instance. But that tension relies upon a compelling government interest to withhold rights in the favor of the public health. Nevertheless, we know that there has not been a compelling government interest because we know that, for example, every year in the United States, 500,000 people die from tobacco-related diseases. That might be a compelling interest, but the government has never made any serious attempts to deal with that problem. And that's certainly a lot more than what we've seen from COVID, let alone in the Omicron era now. So there is no compelling government interest to maintain a heavy-handed emergency order that limits people's fundamental rights. And so the fact that it's doing that and continuing that is an abuse of our constitutional rights, our inherent rights.
But I think it's a good point because we were 3 years, this was 2019, and you had talked to me about the medical community. I would not have viewed the medical community as a threat to my rights. I think a lot of Americans now do, particularly public health and those bureaucracies, as a threat to their individual rights. And so as we have kind of the reckoning of some of the failed policies, there's going to be a lot that needs to be done to try to regain any bit of trust in terms of that. Did you want to speak on any of those issues?
Absolutely. And I come at it not from the public health perspective, but just from the individual patient-doctor perspective. And it is very difficult when you're talking to a patient and right between you there's a mandate. So it definitely has affected the relationship in so many ways. And as I mentioned earlier, I would really hope that going forward we can refocus on meeting the patient where they are, understanding their concerns, answering their questions, focusing on their overall health, metabolic health, making sure that they're getting routine preventive care that's appropriate for their age, and their mental health. There's definitely been better media attention on the mental health of children, but the mental health of adults has been greatly affected as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Hogue, you did a study on mask mandates that was a little bit counter to what the prevailing wisdom is. So can you talk about that study and then kind of the response to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess there's two different studies that I've been involved in that have looked at masks, and I want to talk about the first one because it's often cited as a rationale to mask children in schools, which was a study from Wood County, Wisconsin we had published in MMWR. And there was a mask mandate in place, and we had estimated 92% compliance among the children during the time of that study, fall of 2021, and multiple school districts in Wisconsin, and we found minimal spread within the schools. We found 37% lower case rates in the schools than in the community, and only 7 children throughout the fall caught, in over 5,000 children caught COVID in the schools, and no teachers. And so that was used as evidence that masks worked. So I think we need to talk about the type of evidence that we use to do things, and that there was no control group in that study. So that's just elementary, that you need to have a control group. So it would be like saying because the kids in Wisconsin were wearing pink socks that they, got less COVID, they spread COVID less. But we actually had a control group in Scandinavia, as you know, and in Florida, and there was minimal spread in the schools in Scandinavia, and a Norwegian study that was done at the same time. But that was ignored. Secretary Cardona used it as an example. The media used it as an example of this is evidence that masks work because the mandate was in place. Now we know it's slowing the spread of COVID, when really it could have been any number of things. And so, when we look at the evidence for masks, we have 2 randomized controlled trials, which is the highest form of evidence. And we know that according to the Dan Mask study, that they did not identify at least a 50% benefit to the wearer. And we know that according to the Bangladesh study, that cloth masks were ineffective and surgical masks had a very small effect on people over the age of 50 and no one under that age. And that was in the context of an increased amount of distancing in the surgical mask group. So basically now we have 2 studies, the highest quality evidence saying that mask mandates, especially cloth mask mandates, don't work. And just like Dr. Gupta said, we've really had an inversion of the precautionary principle. And I think that's a great theme because it relates to school closures, lockdowns, masks. We know that masks interfere with communication. The children do not like wearing them. The children with hearing impairments and other impairments have difficulty wearing masks. And yet we're forcing them to do this just because we have this idea that they're going to be doing something good. And we have actually no high quality evidence showing that they are.
Yeah, and the media would cite studies. I mean, I remember when we were having this fight, we had school districts masking kids. We liberated them from it. And they would cite out these studies like North Carolina. Oh, the masks worked. No control group at all in the study. And they're citing this as this is conclusive proof. And, you didn't really even need to do a clinical trial to look. If you have neighboring communities where one school system is masked and the other isn't, and there's no appreciable difference, that's pretty good evidence that this is not something that's really making a big difference as an intervention. But some of these interventions can cause